All right, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. First off, I just want to say happy solstice, happy summer solstice to everyone. I hope it's beautiful and sunny where you are. And welcome to Beaver Institute's Beavers Uncovered, a webinar series on underexplored beaver topics curated by Dr. Bonnie Gulas-Wroblewski and the Beaver Institute. A little bit about our organization. Beaver Institute is a national nonprofit providing the tools and skills for climate-resilient communities to coexist alongside beavers and the bountiful ecological and economic services they provide. How do you build a national grassroots movement for beavers? This is a question we are confronting joyfully every day at the Beaver Institute. This webinar series, along with our Beaver Corps wetland professional training, are an integral part of our strategy to educate the general public and expand beaver consciousness, which is what we're doing today with this webinar. And this series in particular looks to weave disparate narrative experiences from the out in, from the in out to out in, from above, below, around, sort of gathering us in a virtual imaginarium of possibility and opportunity for embers to glow, sparks to fly, and to authentically forge potentially unlikely collaborations. So without further ado, with that sort of as our preamble here, we're going to jump into our presentation today, which is Beavers on the Edge. I want to thank Becca White, who you see here, our extern over the summer from Tufts University. She'll be assisting today with sharing links throughout the presentation. So if there's any further investigation you want to do or support you want to provide to these organizations that we're hosting, that can happen. And if there are questions, you can pop them in the question box, and Bonnie is going to sort of steer me around when we get to open up the floor at the end and hopefully get some of those questions to these people. But first, I just want to introduce you to our panelists, and then we will get going. Becky Fitzpatrick is a restoration ecologist project manager for Watershed Management Group and has a diverse background in both outdoor education and wildlife and ecological field research. Today, she'll be presenting on the Watershed Management Group's binational beaver survey along the San Pedro River in southern Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. Dr. Ken D. Tape is a research associate professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks with the Geophysical Institute and Snow, Ice, and Permafrost Group. He has a broad interest in the Arctic natural sciences, which is strikingly captured in his photographic work, some of which hopefully he'll share with us today. Dr. Tape will be representing the Arctic Beaver Observation Network on today's panel, discussing the expansion of beaver populations into Arctic landscapes. And Dr. Helen Wheeler and Dr. Callum Pearce will also be addressing the northward movement of beavers into the Arctic through the perspective of their work on the beavers and socio-ecological resilience and Inuit Nunangat project. Dr. Wheeler is senior lecturer in the School of Life Sciences at Anglia-Ruskin University, where she leads the Wildlife Change in the Arctic Project and is principal investigator for the Barren Project. Dr. Pearce is a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Life Sciences at Anglia-Ruskin University, applying his expertise in environmental anthropology, anthropology of landscape, and anthropology of religion to Arctic socio-ecological systems. So, I mean, this is an amazing group we have with us today. We're incredibly honored. And I'm just going to turn it over just to jump right into the edge of this with Becky. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, is that through on everyone's end? Excellent. Okay, so as said, my name is Becky, and I'm a restoration ecology project manager with a group called Watershed Management Group. We're based out of Tucson, Arizona. And we have a 50-year vision of restoring the creeks and rivers in Tucson to their heritage flows. And so this is our second annual binational beaver survey on the San Pedro rivers we completed this year. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that, as well as the area in which I'm working. So for those of you who might be up in the Arctic or maybe have not been to the Southwest of the United States, here's a map of the continent. You can see there's some frozen areas of snow, there's green where there's more water, and then this kind of dry, arid area is where Tucson is based. Here's a little zoom in to the area. You can see there's green in the north by Taos and Santa Fe. That's the southern edge of the Rocky Mountains. There's this pink uplift in the center is the Colorado Plateau. And then Tucson, Arizona, we've got down in the south here, which is a part of the Sonoran Desert We get about 12 inches of rain a year. And so it's a pretty dry spot. We're at about 2,000 feet and it's hot. It's about 102 degrees out right now. So where does Tucson get its water? This is a photo of the Central Arizona Project, also known as CAP. If I go back to this other slide here, this north-south border between Arizona and California, that is made by the Colorado River. And so Tucson, you can see, is not anywhere close to the Colorado River, yet we do get a bunch of our municipal water from the Colorado River. That this CAP here, this is a 335-mile canal that's pumped water up and over the desert to Tucson. We get about 145 acre feet a year through that source. So it's not a particularly sustainable source of water for Tucson, but it is really important for us. Naturally, we get our rain from the Santa Rita Mountains and the Rincon Mountains to the north and east of Tucson. You can see them here receiving snow this year. We got snow twice in the city of Tucson, which is a little irregular, but this water is important for surface flows in our shallow groundwater areas. So WMG likes to ask itself, how do we as a community respond to Colorado River shortage of water? And our answer is to shift from being water consumers to water stewards. So how do we do that? WMG uses this term hydro-local. So we're valuing and stewarding renewable water in our area instead of depleting watersheds that are far away. And this is a photo of the Tonka Verde Creek, which is just outside of Tucson. You can also see some invasive species of arundo in this photo. So WMG does restoration workshops. This is a photo of removing the invasive giant reed arundo donax in shallow groundwater areas, which has had some visible effect in raising the water levels of our creeks. We have, mine just, okay, can you see that? Okay, great. My computer just slowed down for a second. So we have a community science program where local stewards will photo document the flow in their creeks. And so that fills in the gaps between the USGS monitoring levels, so we can have a better idea of creek flow. And then the San Pedro Beaver survey, which will be the focus of the rest of this presentation. And so here's a map of the San Pedro River. It doesn't flow through Tucson itself, but it flows around it. And actually the headwaters are down in the south in Mexico, in Sonora, Mexico, as you can see. And then the Santa Cruz does also flow through Tucson. And, okay, so the history of beavers. There were beavers in both the San Pedro and the Santa Cruz rivers and their tributaries. The San Pedro actually once was known as Beaver River, and it played a key role in maintaining watershed health. Beavers played a key role in maintaining watershed health, but like in the rest of most of North America, the beavers were trapped out in the late 1800s. And there was also potential evidence of beavers in Sabino Creek, which is to the north of Tucson. So why beavers? Why are beavers important for watershed management? Mostly what they do is they slow down the water and they spread it out and they let it sink in, and that helps recharge aquifers and groundwater. Here in the Southwest, we have this critical wetland habitat known as cienagas, kind of these like marshy, lowland, kind of flooded valleys. And those are really important here in the Sonoran Desert. And beavers are a nature-based solution for water and habitat restoration. So our binational beaver surveys. Here you can see there's Tucson, and then this is the watershed of the San Pedro River here. And this green area in the middle that's shaded is what's known as the SPRINCA, the San Pedro River National Area, National Conservation Area, which is a protected area managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And so in 1999 and 2000, the BLM reintroduced about 20 beavers to this protected area. And those beavers did really well. They spread out. They, on their own, migrated and moved down into the Mexican portions of the watershed. And around 2010, their populations peaked. Around 100-ish is our guess. They weren't being actively surveyed at that time, but about 100 beavers on the United States side of the watershed. This is a photo of Mike Foster, who is a local beaver devotee. And he and one of his colleagues, Steve Merkley, who works at Cochise College, have taken students out to do informal beaver surveys and kept an eye on the beaver population. So the BLM monitored the beavers for a couple years after their reintroduction. And then after that time period was up, no one was surveying them. And so the population has become unknown and the population trends became unknown. So Steve and Mike Foster were gathering folks to come and do these informal surveys, keep an eye on the trends. And Watershed Management Group, which I work for, heard about this effort and we're like, hey, that sounds like something we'd like to get involved with, and worked together to create these larger surveys, more formal surveys. So it's community science based. This is a photo in Mexico with a group of science volunteers. And yeah, it's community science based. We're still kind of figuring out our protocol and the best ways of practice and how to get our science peer reviewed and how to increase our scientific accuracy so that our results are more shareable. And so with that, we worked with a number of local organizations here in Arizona and also across the border in Mexico, specifically with a group called Profana and a group called Naturalia. And then this year as well, Naturalia invited some folks from the Mexican government. CONAMP is their organization. And so we're getting a little more formal on both sides and expanding our efforts, which is wonderful. And so my screen is sharing really slowly. Okay, here we go. So basically how the surveys work is we invite volunteers to come and survey a section of the river about maybe 3 to 6 miles long. Each volunteer attends an online training session and then goes out with a group lead, and the group lead organizes car shuttles and safety and maps. And volunteers will download, it's a Survey 123 app. We have an app on Survey 123. Here's the QR code. You can test this to see if it works. If not, maybe I can follow up if you're curious on seeing what the survey looks like. But volunteers download it onto their own phones. They don't actually need to log in. They can just skip the login phase. They don't have to have their own account. And on the app, it'll geolocate when you put in a data entry point. And so our binational beaver survey, this is our second one, with the purpose of understanding this beaver population and how it is either growing or shrinking and how it may be spreading. On the Mexico side, it's about 30 miles that were surveyed. And we held our surveys this year in February, which was pretty snowy and cold. And we needed 4-wheel drive to get to our sites that were pretty muddy. We had about 20 participants from a number of groups, and we all used the Survey 123 app. And much of the same in Arizona. This is the second survey. On the Arizona side, we surveyed about 40 miles. And then surveys were held in November. In December, we had a big winter storm come through. And so the rest of the surveys were pushed off until February. We had about 75 people participate in these surveys and also use the same Survey 123 app. So what are we looking for? We are looking for evidence of beavers. There may be dams, lodges, slides, chews, food caches, scat, tracks, scent mounds, and then habitat characteristics. Excuse me. So when we find this evidence of beavers, we also track habitat characteristics, trees with herbivory on them, the most abundant tree species near where we found that activity, the river flow rates, which does change depending on the time of year. The San Pedro is an intermittent river. And then also the presence of cows. The Sprinka is protected, and so there actually should not be cattle, but fences break and cows do get in there fairly regularly. And so we're documenting presence of cows, also just to give to the BLM. And so this is a photo of a volunteer recording evidence of an old chew you can see here. And so each group, we like to have at least 4 people. So you can have 1 person surveying each bank and 2 people in the river, like walking through the water. Some places it's about knee deep. And when we find evidence of beavers, the group usually comes together and brains up and decides together how to fill out the data sheet. 1 person will fill it out and submit it. This is a photo of a kind of cienega, a human dammed cienega area in Mexico. We're looking towards the north here, just to give you an idea of what the area in Mexico does look like. It is an international area, and so this is actually a photo of the San Pedro as it crosses the border wall. This is from Mexico looking north into the United States. And so there is some complication because it is a binational area. So our results for 2003, we had a total data entry of 291 points with about 10 total lodges. Most of those were in Mexico. We only had one active dams in the United States. 3 active lodges in the US, 9 in Mexico. Recent chews, we found a bunch of recent chews, and then tracks, scent mounds, scats, etc. So to estimate the beaver population, we used 4 beavers per family group. Excuse me. And one family group, we estimated 1 family group per cluster of activity. That was at least ½ mile apart and no more than 1 mile apart. And so a cluster was determined by either an active dam, an active lodge, or a substantial amount of recent activity, including chews, tracks, slides, or an active scent mound. And so using those protocols in the United States in 2022 and 23, we estimated there were about 13 to 17 beavers, which is a decline from the 2021 survey. And in Mexico, we estimated about 24 to 26 beavers, which is an expansion of beavers. That's more beavers than 2021. And chatting with local folks, it sounds like in the United States, this might be a high estimate. And in Mexico, it might actually be a low estimate, which feels good for our protocol if we're right in the middle, but we're still trying to figure out if we can refine our protocol at all. So the presence of cattle, this is a photo from Mexico. They're a major, there's lots of cattle, and they disturb the beaver habitat area. They trample vegetation and degrade the riverbanks. And culturally, they're really important, and they're a way to make money, and it's a part of the lifestyle in the area. But in the Sprinka area, the protected area on the United States side, we're hoping to increase funding for fencing and for cattle removal, so that less cattle get in that protected area. And so we're also working with a private partner on a tributary of the Baba Kamari, called the Baba Kamari River of the San Pedro, to also make a habitat in that area that beaver might be enticed to come to expand the population outside the banks of the San Pedro. We integrated cattle presence into the survey this year with questions where you can take photos about visible cows, dung, and tracks, and then we share that data with the BLM so they know where there might be breaks in their fence. So lessons learned and next steps. The population patterns have been similar in the last couple of years, which means maybe a stable-ish population, but it's only been 2 years, so it's really hard to say. With a slight decline in the US and a slight increase on the Mexico side. The river flow levels are also something that we're figuring out how those affect beaver. We just collaborated with the Nature Conservancy, does a wet dry map of the San Pedro River every June. And so that was just completed this past Saturday. And so we're hoping to put our beaver data on top of the wet dry mapping and see how the water flows affect where beaver sign is seen. And so the most recent activities are at medium or high flow areas, where some parts of the river are actually dry at this time of the year for long stretches. And future reintroduction efforts, we're working with local landowners to see if they might be interested in creating habitat beavers might be enticed to come to, and keeping the cattle out. Advocacy, there's another area called Cienega Creek, which is also managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which could be a spot for more beaver introduction. And WMG has this Release the Beaver campaign, which is mostly like to bring the idea of beavers in the Southwest watersheds back into people's minds as something that could be positive action rather than seeing beavers as a nuisance species. Things that still have to be done. There's environmental assessment on reestablishing beavers. It's required by the BLM. And they have to document how introducing beavers would impact the local areas. And so they finalized their EA and they've submitted it to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the next step is now that the Fish and Wildlife Service has that BLM EA, they have to issue their biological opinion. That should take about 9 months from this April. And then WMG, we keep building more support and doing education and advocacy work. And then the BLM and WMG are working together to do a fencing survey at Las Ciénegas, which is that other area where beavers might be able to be reintroduced. But we'd like to have fencing there first so we can keep cattle out of the area before introducing beavers. And then Arizona Game and Fish and the BLM are both conducting wet dry mapping, like I said, last Saturday, and then this Friday, those will be done. Here's just a pretty photo of the United States side of the San Pedro in a section that's flowing. Another pretty photo. This is a reservoir on the Mexico side, and there's actually a little lodge, a little bank lodge. We found that most of the lodges here are in the banks. They're more dug banks than stick lodges. And you can see that it is pretty incised and also just beautiful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Becky. That was great. We're going to keep moving this along to our next presenter. We'll get to the questions and conversations at the ends, but I really appreciate that. And one moment here, I'm going to get to my script so I remember who's next. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ken Tape. So take it away, Ken.
Thanks a lot, Adam. Wow, that was super interesting, Becky. Thank you. I have so many questions. Really exciting to see beavers in the Southwest. I have relatives down in Phoenix and Santa Fe. So I'm up in Fairbanks, Alaska. Just finished my first cup of coffee. It's, 8 a.m., 8:25 a.m. here. But yeah, I love the Southwest, and it's fascinating. I saw that they were being reintroduced in Bandelier National Monument, for example, which is in northwestern New Mexico. And it's just really amazing to see what they can do in an arid or semi-arid environment, but mostly just to see how adaptable they are. I mean, it's, and when I say that, I'm just contrasting the pictures I'm about to show you from where beavers are moving into in the Arctic in northern and western Alaska, and it just could not be more different. And so, yeah, it's just really exciting to see that and see how well they're doing. It does strike me that on those intermittent streams, you said at the end there that they were, the BLM had, was sort of looking at the places that actually had the habitat to support beavers, for the reintroductions. And I can see that because it looks borderline, but I think for habitat, but I think people would also say that about the tundra, and yet here they are. So let me go full screen here. So my name is Ken Tape. I'm up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And my primary collaborators here are Ben Jones and Jason Clark. And I also represent, along with Helen Wheeler, who's also on this conference, I represent the Arctic Beaver Observation Network, which is a group of scientists, indigenous people, indigenous groups, and land managers who are, keenly interested in this issue of beavers colonizing Arctic tundra streams. And most of this work is supported by the National Science Foundation, with a little bit more recently from NASA. So here's a graphic that appeared in National Geographic a few years ago. It was sort of like the fold out in the center, and it summarizes a lot of the different changes that are going on in the Arctic right now. As most of you know, the Arctic is experiencing warming, climate change over the last, several decades to a century. It actually started in the late 19th century. And in response to those warmer temperatures, a lot of changes are occurring. And this graphic attempts to capture a number of those changes in one place, an idealized graphic here. So you got the tundra fires over here on the left. This is what we call a thaw slump. So you get a little bit of permafrost thawing, and you get these landslides that are related to permafrost thaw. We've got shrinking glaciers up here. These troughs here with the water in them, this is what the Arctic landscape looks like. It's called ice wedge polygonal ground. So when you get these flat areas with ice-rich permafrost, that is permafrost being, ground that's frozen year-round. And when they start to thaw, you get these water troughs at the surface. So this is sort of depicting, again, another way that the ground is thawing in the Arctic. And then the right here, we have a bunch of shrubs. So as you can imagine, as it gets warmer, we get a lot more shrubby vegetation. All the vegetation starts doing better. It's more productive, right? Shorter winters, longer summers, warmer summers, kind of what you would expect. And we get shrub herbivores. So, animals that depend on shrubs for food moving into the Arctic, such as moose are moving into the Arctic of northern and western Alaska. And then beavers made the cut as well here down in the lower right. So beavers are moving into this tundra environment, partly in response to rebound. They're partly rebounding from being overtrapped for over a century, but also their habitat is improving quite a bit. There's more unfrozen water in the winter in these streams that might have frozen to the bottom before now have some water flowing in them. And also this shrubby vegetation, which of course is what they eat. So there's no trees, right? Beavers do not need trees. That is a somewhat common misconception that we're seeing, play out in real time. And so it's partly the improvement of their habitat is causing beavers to move into the Arctic tundra. I didn't study beavers up until about 8 years ago. I studied all kinds of climate change, landscape change, and wildlife change in the Arctic, but I started wondering about, what's the next species that's going to wander into the Arctic? And beavers seemed like a really interesting one to study. And the main reason one of the important, beavers, when they engineer these streams, they leave a mark on the landscape that you can see from space. So I sort of had the idea that, maybe we can see ponds forming and disappearing in satellite imagery and old aerial photography through time. And so this is what that looks like. This top image, it's red, but it's color infrared photography from 1980. That's actually green. That's green tundra. So just flip that around in your mind. And that's a stream about as wide as my office flowing across the tundra. And the blue arrow just shows which way the stream is flowing. And you can see by 2019, it's just it's totally changed. And what you have is all the black is water. And then all these little things are dams. There's just dams throughout this picture. Like this here, this here is a 100-meter long dam. And you can see there's multiple dams that are 100 meters long in this picture. So for us who study climate change, who study how the Arctic landscape was changing, this was super exciting. All of a sudden, we're dealing with this wildlife ecosystem engineer who's coming in and just wholesale changing the landscape. So it was both exciting and, you know, a little bit scary. Here's another example of what that looks like. This is in Western Alaska. This is tundra. Again, there's no trees. There were a few trees in that last picture. That was at tree line. There's no trees in this picture. And you got flow direction here, 2003. By 2016, beavers have put in all these dams. And one interesting thing with the Southwest is if you look at a pond like this, it actually looks like these giant reservoirs in the Southwest because they're doing something similar. They're damming streams. Of course, they're not damming the Colorado River here, but they're damming these small streams. And I always think this pond here looks a lot like the reservoirs that you see in the Southwest. So, you know, they're really changing the landscape in so many ways that it's hard to list them all. I'll give a shot at it a little bit later. But our early questions in this project are, you know, what is the scale of beaver engineering in the Arctic and how is that changing? So a simple question like, where are beavers in the Arctic tundra is actually, that's an important question, and it's not that easy to answer because there's no roads out there. There are people out in these remote communities, and sure enough, they have observed a lot of these changes. But, you know, we're really getting to the point now where we know where they are, for example, in Alaska, but we don't know, you know, where the northern limit of beavers are, for example, in Canada. And maybe Helen and Callum can speak to a little bit to that issue, because that's a lot of their research is in Canada, where ours has focused initially in Alaska. But so, yeah, just trying to figure out where they are. And then just as important, what is the nature of the impacts that beavers are having on these Arctic tundra stream ecosystems and riparian ecosystems? Basically, any lowland ecosystem that is going to be beaver habitat will probably get occupied by beavers in the next, you know, several decades, depending on how fast they disperse. And so we need to understand what that future Arctic looks like. And so we're starting to understand, you know, the impacts to permafrost, that is the physical impacts, and hydrology. I think we have an idea because we can sort of apply all the research that's been done in the lower 48, as we call it, the conterminous United States, to what's happening in the tundra. But very little, you know, research has been done on tundra beaver ponds. And so a lot of our ideas are still at the hypothesis stage, and we have active research underway, but we don't necessarily have answers to those questions yet. But we think that beavers create a kind of oasis, much as they probably do in the Southwest. They create a kind of oasis that allows a warmer place with more unfrozen water in winter, that has greater biodiversity, and all the things that you would expect. Yeah, so those are most of our hypotheses hinge around this oasis concept. So here's a map of northern Alaska, and you can see right here, this is northern Alaska right here. I'm way down in the corner somewhere in Fairbanks here. The tundra is the northern western part of the state. So everything in gray here is forested. So we can ignore the forested section for a minute. And everything that's colored is tundra. And this is a heat map of beaver pond density. So I flew around virtually using satellite imagery and basically flew every creek and river and lake in northern western Alaska, mapped about 12,000 beaver ponds. And so this map shows where those beaver ponds are. The yellow is high beaver pond density. So we're seeing here the footprint that beavers are making in the tundra regions of Alaska, where you have yellow, it's high beaver density. There's a lot of beaver ponds on all of those streams. And where you have dark blue, there are 0 ponds. So what I find that's kind of cool about this figure is, okay, we can see where they are. We can see these warmer lowland areas are the areas that they've moved into initially. But we also see that this entire northern region of Alaska, we call this a North Slope of Alaska, a huge tundra, mostly lowland area that has ample beaver habitat, at least that's what it looks like to me, is they're right. This red line here is the continental divide of the Brooks Range, and beavers are right at the continental divide of the Brooks Range, and they're poised to swim downstream. They just have to find the habitat down here. And so, if you had to guess in, 20 to 50 to 100 years, the North Slope, if these trends continue, the North Slope is going to look like these areas down here. And that is indeed what our initial model results show. So pretty interesting. This is the situation up there and what we think is unfolding. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this figure. It's kind of complicated. It's a bit of a mess, but basically beaver ponds in Western Alaska have doubled in the last, from 2003 to 2017. So about 15-year period, beaver ponds have doubled. They're colonizing new streams like that imagery I showed you earlier. And it's pretty dramatic as landscape change in the Arctic goes. There's a local cartoonist here in Fairbanks whose name is Jamie Smith, and one of his primary animals that he uses in his cartoons are beavers. And I think it's because beavers are a lot like people. They remind us a little bit of ourselves. But this is amazing because this is a cartoon that he drew in 2001. And in fact, it was just happened to be an amazing prophecy because this is exactly the scene that is unfolding in northern and western Alaska in 2001 and 2010 and now, where you have these beavers that are looking out over new tundra landscapes that are unoccupied, unengineered by beavers, and they're moving into those landscapes by the hundreds, at least, if not thousands. So if you look at an area, if we zoom in a little bit, we looked at the big scale of Alaska. If we zoom in a little bit, this is an area around the village of Kotzebue, way out in northwestern Alaska, way out on the Bering Sea there. 2002, you had 2 beaver dams. By 2019, in that same small area, you had 98 beaver dams. If we look at a little bit larger area around the village of Kotzebue here, 2010 beaver dams in yellow, 94 by 2019, you had 409. So again, just giving you the impression of how rapidly beavers are moving into these areas. Zooming in yet a little bit closer, this is what a beaver pond in the tundra looks like. You can see the lodge right here. The water's flowing right to left. This is about an 85-meter long dam, and it's about 130 meters now. It's quite a bit longer than it was when this picture was taken a few years ago. You can see multiple dams. You go up and down the stream, there's a lot more beaver dams. And again, this was a stream that was, about as wide as my office prior to the beavers arriving, and they've created this wetland as they've engineered and moved into these streams. I actually just threw this winter picture in here 5 minutes ago while Becky was talking, because I wanted to have a picture from the winter to just give you an idea of how improbable it is that they are out there. And this is not the most unforgiving place that I've seen beaver ponds, beaver lodges and beaver ponds. It gets quite a bit bleaker than this, if you can imagine that. There is a little bit of vegetation sticking up here, a little bit of shrubs. But yeah, the water direction is flowing this way. Here we are. We're out there on snow machines in the winter. We do some pretty big trips. Last year, we did a 400+ mile trip from Nome to Kotzebue, visiting these beaver ponds in the winter, trying to understand a little bit better how they're actually surviving out there, and then measuring things like water quality, water temperature, and things like that. But anyway, here's the beaver lodge right here, and they managed to get by in this environment, and not just get by, but they're actually thriving. So anyway, back to fun summer pictures that looks more like beaver habitat. This is another example of a beaver pond. This picture, there's a bunch of beaver ponds. There's a beaver pond out here. You can see the lodge. There's Beaver Pond here. You can see the lodge. This entire area, there's beaver. I got lost in a pack raft back here. It's a labyrinth of channels and dams and engineered landscape. You can see the beavers dam the entire river in places. There's beaver lodges everywhere. So as the Arctic gets filled in with beavers, this is the kind of vision that we can expect. Most of the water in this scene is being stored on the landscape by beavers, with the exception of the river channel itself. This water is all being stored on the landscape by beavers. So it's really cool to think of beavers moving into the southwestern United States and transitioning these arid environments and creating these miniature wetlands along these streams. I think it's a step in the right direction for sure, at least from my perspective. So one of the things that beavers do when they pond all this water on the landscape, they're creating a heat sink, and they thaw permafrost. And they thought permafrost the frozen ground is in a very delicate balance with hydrology and with climate. So when you throw in an ecological disturbance like beavers, permafrost thaws almost inevitably. I mean, there will be some places where that's not the case, but by and large, what we're seeing is permafrost thaw as these beaver ponds are created. So here we had a stream that flowed right to left, right here, sort of up near the top of the screen. It was just there, just that little stream there flowing right to left. And the beaver got in there and started damming the water and diverting it. This entire area, this is what we call thermokarst. This is all landscape that is thawed and just fallen apart due to beavers diverting water and thawing permafrost. And so that is sort of one of the big climate concerns with beavers moving into tundra regions. And that's one that the media tends to focus on a lot. I don't know if it's because it's a negative or because it's a global issue, but we are concerned, and I think there is a general concern that creating these ponds thaws permafrost, releases carbon and methane to the atmosphere, which then exacerbates climate change. And I think more generally, the impacts that beavers are having on the landscape, not just with thawing permafrost, but just as an ecological disturbance, they are exacerbating the effects of climate change at all these locations where they're creating ponds. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but basically we started with these ideas of where are beavers and when did they get there? Where are they headed? These sort of geospatial questions on a fairly large scale. And as we begin to answer some of those questions, physical questions like permafrost, then we get into a lot of the really exciting stuff which lies ahead of us, using eDNA to look at biodiversity, looking at water quality, and we just had a paper come out that it says in review here, but I think it just got accepted, that shows that these methane emissions are higher where you have beaver ponds in the tundra, which isn't surprising, but it's still something that we had to demonstrate scientifically. So we're getting into the more interesting questions of how they're changing the biology and just all these downstream consequences of their engineering. Oh yeah, fish. And I see boat access on the bottom of this list as well. So we're looking at a broad range of impacts, much like Becky described. Possible causes. Yeah, it's a combination of increasing habitat, but also rebound from overtrapping. And I also do want to mention that we have a pretty big indigenous knowledge component on this project, but it's also fairly recent. So we work in these, we spend time in these communities. We bump into people out on the tundra, but we also have a formal part of the project that is relatively young. So I'm not going to present any results from it, but we have Caroline Brown and Helen with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Subsistence Division, and they work in 3 communities, Shugnak, Kotzebue, and Noatak. They work in 3 communities, interviewing people, asking many of the same questions that we're asking here about beavers, and also sharing our scientific results. And so we call it co-production of knowledge but I don't have any of those results to present because they're pretty new, and that part of the project just started a couple of years ago. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to discuss. I'm sure I missed some things, but we can get back to them in the questions, and hopefully I haven't gone over time. And a quick shout out to the Arctic Beaver Observation Network. If someone here is interested in becoming a part of the Arctic Beaver Observation Network, we're having a meeting in Fairbanks in late February of 2024. We've had a couple meetings already. One in Yellowknife that involved a lot of Indigenous participants that Helen Wheeler was in charge of. We had a virtual meeting before that during COVID. So send me an email. I'll put you on the email list, and you can stay up to date on these Arctic beaver issues. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to pass it now over. We're just going to be trucking right along here. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Helen Wheeler.
Okay, I'll just get this up. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific Arctic project that we've had going for just over a year now in the Northwest Territories in Canada. I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction to the project, and then I'm going to pass over to Callum, who is going to go into detail on the human side of the project, which hopefully complements the particularly ecological side that Ken was talking about in Alaska. So really briefly, the project that we are working on is entitled Beavers and Socio-ecological Resilience in Inuit Nunangat. And this is a bit of a unique funding opportunity, actually, in that it's a partnership between Canada, the UK, and has a Indigenous co-investigator as part of it. So we're working with the Fisheries Joint Management Committee, which is a Nunavut organization, and Herb Nakimayak is our co-investigator and that the Fisheries Joint Management Committee have been a key part of our project, as have various Indigenous communities in developing the project. So prior to even starting the work, we were really trying to get an ethic of co-production to figure out what the key questions people wanted answered locally were, and how we could best try and address these. And so even the research proposal was evaluated both by the UK Research Council, Canadian Research Council, and the ITK, which is the Inuit organization for Inuit knowledge. So there's been that oversight of the project that we're trying to really address some of the needs of, in our case, Nunavut communities in the region. So I just wanted to start out really by thinking about some of the similarities and contrasts with our work with not projects outside the Arctic. So beavers are an influential species, and we see that pretty much wherever they occur. They have big influences on the environment. Some of these, the physical ones that Ken's already spoken about quite a lot. So I'll keep that side brief, but obviously their dam creation creates hydrological change. That change in simply having an area of water essentially creates what we call albedo change. So that's affecting the reflectivity of the surface of the earth. And that's related to these processes of permafrost thaw and other processes that are occurring related to the land and changes in the frozen part of the land. So there's physical, we all know that there's pretty broad physical responses to beavers inhabiting an area. And then there's the biological responses that cascade from that as well. So they're changing habitats. We see interactions with other species that could be facilitating lots of new species or more of the same species, or it could be reductions in certain species as well. So what we end up with is altered communities. What we're going to focus on a bit more after I've done my introduction is the socio-cultural side of these changes. So many communities in the north are experiencing very rapid climate change, and alongside that, they're experiencing, environmental changes that are pretty substantial. And so we're at pretty early stages of this research, but what we often hear is concerns about changing environment. And that can be around changing food availability, harvesting practices, changing access and travel routes, and changing human nature connections too. And so we know beavers can create these cascading impacts, whether they're biophysical, but also when people have strong connections to the land, when they're socio-cultural. And I think one thing that's really important is there is context specificity to both how ecosystems and people are impacted by beavers or the changes that occur. So in one place, they might be seen as a great benefit, whereas in other places, they might be a cause for concern. And so the Arctic is unique in many ways. It's got this frozen landscape that we need to take into consideration, and also has people who have often strong connections to the land and are experiencing already quite rapid environmental change. So that all plays into the role of these environmental changes that are being experienced now. So in order to do this project, we formed a number of partnerships. As I mentioned, the first was with the Fisheries Joint Management Committee, which is an Indigenous organisation. And really, before even applying for funding, we were talking to people about what research did we need to do and how should we do it. So this is just some examples of our meetings. Can have plenty of meetings in boardrooms and all that sort of thing, but there's nothing quite like getting out on the land and discussing things and discussing techniques and sharing knowledge and information as well. So we've really benefited from a lot of people's knowledge out on the land where we work, and that's really a core part of the project. Not only working with people and really respecting their knowledge, but also helping support transitions to more locally led research as well. Something to be particularly aware of as someone from the UK working outside their own country too. As Ken mentioned, we had our meeting in Yellowknife in November 2022. So that was a really nice opportunity then to share ideas around beaver research, beaver management, all sorts of questions there. Not only with the communities that we were working with in the Barron project, so that's the Inuit communities, but we had communities come in from Nunavik as well. And I think particularly many of the participants really appreciated that knowledge sharing that occurred there. So we talked about things like priority areas for research in the region. So you can see the kind of map, and we had some discussions over that. Priority species, where people were interested in change and what changes might occur. We really spent some time kind of discussing many different aspects of beaver research and the changes that occur when beavers are around. Some interesting things that came up were particularly around some of the kind of mechanisms that are used to manage beavers in the environment, whether they'd work in this kind of frozen environment where we get this these kind of long periods of freeze action in various places, and whether they were going to work in the same way that they might in other areas where we've got such extremes of cold in this environment. Okay, and so that's one project, is this one in the Inuit settlement region. The other project that I've been working with the Gwich'in Renewable Resource Board since 2019 is a community-based monitoring project. So here we have been monitoring beavers since 2019, which we were very lucky that the community members got involved from an early stage, which meant during the pandemic, the research continued without researchers coming in from outside the community, and ongoing monitoring occurred there. So that is a slightly different, slightly smaller project, but that's more focused on just monitoring change in the occupancy of beavers in the environment. And we're really lucky with that project that since in the 1960s, there was a Canadian Wildlife Service researcher that worked in that same area. We in fact stay in his cabin when we're doing the work. And he did surveys of beavers back then. So we can actually look at the changes since 1962. What we've seen so far is approximately a doubling in numbers, which in that period isn't quite at the same rate that Ken's seeing in his research. And this is our most southerly research area, and so certainly the information that's being shared around the rate of change further north, where people have been seeing changes in about the last 20 years. That seems to be more rapid than this area in the south of the Northwest Territories on the Mackenzie Delta. So in terms of going back to the bigger project, there were two kind of types of aims that were part of this project. So the first is really trying to understand those shifts that occur and those biophysical shifts that occur when beavers come into a region. What are the changes that occur? And then we wanted to understand the connections between those ecosystem shifts and those biophysical shifts and how that affects Inuit communities and their well-being. So those are the kind of broad overarching science questions of the project. But in partnership with the Inuit communities, we were also really aware that there were some concerns they had about the changes they were seeing, and they wanted to understand those. And so we also had some priorities that were around decision-making and co-production within the project. So those were the co-production of information in the really quite near term, just knowing about, mapping where beavers are, the changes that are being observed and those sort of things, and some of the social and ecological impacts that are both being reported and that we can scientifically record as well. And people were, really quite concerned about some of the changes they were seeing. So there's an understanding that these are needed by communities in the near term. In the longer term, though, as I mentioned already, what we're trying to do is create toolkits and infrastructure that people can use locally to really facilitate long-term research, which is going to support the self-determination of Inuit communities in really taking this science forward as they see fit, to support the governance of their land. So that's where the project's coming from. And so there's four major components to the project. First is really understanding and changes in beavers. So that's mapping lodges and dams in various ways, also trying to understand past occupancy using dendrochronological methods. Also using remote sensing imagery and signals of hydrological change to, over larger areas, understand the changes in beavers we're seeing. And one of the biggest challenges in such a vast and relatively remote region is really identifying active and inactive areas. There's some places where it's quite obvious that there's activity, but it's the inactive ones where it can be sometimes unclear. And so we're working on a range of different techniques to try and increase the accuracy of those observations and also support community monitoring of that. Then we can look at lakes and streams. So one of our partners is leading the work on lakes and streams, Philip Marsh at Wilfrid Laurier University. And they're looking at hydrological changes and trying to really take a specific Arctic focus on what hydrological changes have been seen. That obviously links to permafrost and also biogeochemistry. So we have teams working on both of those. As I mentioned, we're working with the Fisheries Joint Management Committee. So another priority is fish. One of the key concerns people have is what are the potential impacts of fish and having these dams? And so in response to that concern, we're looking at invertebrate communities, water quality, and also fish monitoring, particularly trying to develop community-based protocols for fish monitoring, working with a number of collaborators there as well. And then finally, Callum's going to expand on the work on livelihoods and well-being. So I'm not going to go too much into that. But as I said, really key to this project is we're trying to have as much dialogue as possible with various Indigenous organisations to make sure what we're doing is actually useful and something they can take forward in the long term and past the duration of this project. And so for those of you who are not so aware of Northern Canada, the Northwest Territories is right bordering Alaska there, and we're working in the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit settlement regions, which is in the Northwest Territories of Canada. So here, there's been some really rapid changes that have been occurring actually related to infrastructure. So in 2018, the Inuvik Tucson Highway was built and connected communities by road that had previously only been connected by ice road. And so that obviously creates many, many different changes, both environmental, and many people are looking at the impacts of that road, but also social as well, in terms of how those connections between those communities. And so a lot of our work is focused around this area, partly due to the ease of access along this dirt road that is 170 kilometers long. And so adjacent to the road, we're surveying a number of focal sites, lakes and streams, to get beaver occupancy and those hydrological measures, those permafrost measures, and the fish measures as well. The other project, if we go back to that last slide, if you look at Aklavik and Inuit in the south there, is a little bit further south down the Mackenzie Delta, and this is the area that this Canadian Wildlife Service researcher in the 1960s was studying, called Vern Hawley. So we're just on the east branch of the Mackenzie Delta there, and a much more river dominated environment, whereas very lake rich environment in the other project. So again, very different context specific responses that we're seeing. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what that looks like. So this is the Inuvik Highway. There's our SUV on the road, and you can see some of the lakes. So some of these lakes are pre-existing lakes where beavers have established. There's also damming of rivers. And what we're doing is working along this highway to firstly just try and enumerate what the density of features related to beavers, active lodges, and such like are, and then look at some of those impacts, and then work with communities to look at how they perceive those impacts as well. This is the other site, so we're very privileged to work on the Mackenzie Delta as well, and there's Ben Hawley's cabin, and so we're also doing research there on a smaller scale, mainly focused on the monitoring of changes in beaver populations. And that each year we have a kind of community team that I tend to go out with, and we're monitoring some of the changes just to get an idea of the extent of the change in a more southerly environment. Again, really working with community members to understand how they perceive changes as well. So this is really the overview of the project, which Callum's going to go into detail on work package 7 next. And then really the aim is to try and synthesize these different components to understand how this northward expansion of an ecosystem engineer is impacting ecosystems on a more holistic level, and also how that is impacting people. What are their perceptions of that change? What are the potential pathways to resilience and adaptation? And what are people's needs and wants for the future? So this obviously has to be very grounded in local decision making and Indigenous needs in terms of the project. So there's lots of people involved in this project. I just thought I ought to do a quick slide on some of the key teams and team and co-investigators. We also have a growing number of research associates and postdoctoral fellows, and Callum's going to come and talk to you about this, and also some core community members who've been incredibly supportive of the project and been helping us move things along. So I'll leave it there and happy to take questions at the end.
We'll pass it over to Callum then.
Okay, just a sec. Okay, so hopefully that's visible. Okay, so I'm Callum. I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a biologist, I'm an anthropologist. My concern is with people, and specifically the way in which people relate to their environment, the way in which they perceive their environment, and understand changes within it. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about research that actually I haven't really done yet. I'm going to talk about the background to this. I'm going out in a few weeks to talk to people in the region that we're studying in order to understand how they relate to beavers and how they perceive changes introduced along with beavers. I should say at this point before I go on, I'm not trying to speak for Inuvialuit communities. I'm just going to try to give some sort of background to this issue and trying to think about some of the reasons why beavers are experienced as so disruptive in some areas, and think about how that links in with understandings of human environment and human animal relations, and the links with livelihood and well-being, which is really the area I'm concerned with. So as Helen mentioned, this project, this BARIN project, is examining essentially the impact of beaver expansion into the Arctic. It is funded, as she mentioned, by this program SINUC, and SINUC is intended to promote collaboration with Inuit communities and the co-production of research with Inuit communities. So this research is being designed around the priorities coming from Inuvialuit communities. The Inuvialuit, previously I think known as the Western Canadian Inuit, so they're groups that live in roughly this region. This is the Inuvialuit settlement region, which spans across parts of the Northwest Territories and Yukon within Canada. So we're working, or I'm working really with people in 3 communities. So these are Tuktoyaktuk, Inuvik, and Aklavik, southwest of the ISR. Yeah, and sort of talking to people, or I will be talking to people about the impact of beavers, about their understanding of how beavers fit in within their understanding of relations with the environment, and relations with non-human beings and this kind of thing. So as Helen outlined, the Barren Project as a whole covers these kind of 4 main areas. I'm concerned with the 4th of these, with the impacts on human livelihood and well-being, with understanding relations between humans and beavers, and relations between humans and the environment more broadly. Okay, so I should say also at this point that wildlife and fish in this area have been co-managed since 1984, that is to say co-managed by Inuvialuit communities with the territorial and the federal government. So really anything that deals with wildlife management, anything that deals with populations of animals, for instance, it needs to go through Indigenous communities. That's really kind of an important feature of the Inuvialuit final agreement with the Canadian government from 1984. So just to give some sort of background to this, again, as I mentioned, what we're trying to do here is to address research priorities that are coming from Inuvialuit communities. Beavers in this area have been regarded as a kind of invasive species. So people have reported first encountering beavers at various points in the last, I think, 10 to 20 years. Specific Inuvialuit hunters and trappers have been quoted in news articles as first encountering beavers on tundra in, I think, 2016. There are also reports of them as a new species in certain areas around 2005. So it's not entirely clear, I think, from some of the evidence that's out there when these were first encountered, but certainly they're experienced as being something that's new. It's not really part of the established ecosystem as people understand it, at least in tundra areas within the ISR. As Ken has discussed, beaver expansion, it's linked to climate change. It's following many cases climate change, but on a local level, there's evidence that beaver activity may be accelerating local signs of climate change. So through flooding that then is linked to permafrost melt. So in other words, when beavers come into an area, that's perhaps part of a wider process of change that's happening within the environment, but it's accelerating and perhaps exacerbating individual changes, local changes that people are seeing. And so that's sort of seeing as a connection to wider changes there. There have been various responses to this in the past in this area, both promoted by communities and promoted by government. So, oh yes, I should say, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. One of the reasons why this is such an issue, and this I'll come back to this in a moment, Inuvialuit are engaged in subsistence activities, in activities on the land, particularly fishing is affected by beavers. So one key concern is the way in which fishing creeks might be blocked by dams. I'll come back to this though, because I think this is more complicated than this. And the disruption that is being experienced isn't just about certain activities being interrupted or about beavers interfering with certain activities. It's about wider ramifications and wider consequences of that. Anyway, as I was saying, there have been a number of attempts to kind of respond to this and to respond to this kind of sense of disruption from both a community and a government level. In the past, this has tended to focus on trapping initiatives. So there was, for instance, a bounty on beavers, where there were incentives put in place to trap beavers. This ended, I should say, in 2018. And one of the reasons it ended was because of Inuvialuit concerns that the system was being abused and that it was encouraging the wasteful trapping of beavers, which was something that local communities did not want. This is a kind of complicated area, and it's a complicated area that relates to local understandings of how people should relate to the environment and the respect that people should show for animals and the environment. Which I'll come back to in a moment. In addition to this, the government has been offering incentives, that is to say, guarantees payments for furs, and had opened up, I forget when, this is a few years ago, payments for castor sacs. So in other words, there are incentives that are coming from a government level for people to trap beavers. But this isn't really a solution to any of the disruption as such. So let's go back to this point about why this is such an issue and why the presence of beavers in the Nunangat settlement region is experienced as such an issue. Again, I'm not speaking for the communities or on behalf of the communities. I'm just trying to sort of think through how this might be relevant for wider issues of livelihood and well-being, and trying to think about this from a kind of perspective of environmental anthropology. My approach is to understand the way in which people relate to their environment, not as sort of separate entities, but as interwoven with their environment, and to understand the way people come to know the world around them and the environment around them is through ongoing patterns of activity, ongoing patterns of usually seasonal activity. For instance, hunting and trapping and fishing, these kinds of things, which through being carried out, establish and contribute to the maintenance of relations with the environment and relations with animals and other non-human beings. This is an approach within anthropology that's been used in particular to understand the way indigenous people understand their environment and relate to their environment. And what it's trying to do is think about the ways in which people engage in relations with animals and respond to animals to a certain extent. Changes to the environment then don't just involve physical transformations. They don't just involve, say, new lakes in certain areas or less water in certain areas, but rather they pose a challenge, I suppose, for activities or a pattern of activities that are linked to the maintenance of networks of relations between people and animals. And by interfering with those activities or disrupting those activities, they're also disrupting established networks and understandings of relations with animals. Because this is the approach that I would take from an anthropological perspective. So what that means in practice is increasing unpredictability. This is a theme that we find coming through in the literature on indigenous relationships with the environment and climate change, especially in subarctic and Arctic regions. That across these regions, people are experiencing environmental change as increasing unreliability, increasing unpredictability. The knowledge that they had used to relate to the world around them is no longer as reliable as it was. The relations that they felt they had with animals and with the environment are no longer as reliable as they were. Animals are migrating at different periods. Ice is freezing at different times of year. Fish are in different areas or aren't present at all. New species are present. This is unsettling and dislocating, we might say. In terms of Inuit communities, one theme that comes out repeatedly, again, in established literature, is that Inuit community members often tend to describe their sense of well-being as very much tied to activities out on the land, tied to activities like hunting, trapping, and fishing, and to being on the land and to maintaining these kinds of connections to the land. And the activities contribute, or are often understood or described to contribute to this sense of well-being and this sense of identity, indigenous identity and collective identity. So the point I'm trying to make here really is that there's this idea then that a beaver is not just an animal, it's the whole ecosystem. But the introduction of a beaver into a new area isn't just the introduction of a new species, and it isn't just a series of physical changes to the environment. It also has knock-on effects on the way people inhabit that environment, the way people relate to that environment, the way they understand their role within that environment and themselves, and the way in which they maintain relations with that environment and with animals within that environment, especially respectful relations with animals in that environment. So this is, I think, the underlying issue here. This is what I'm going to be trying to look at, trying to understand really why change here is experienced as so disruptive. Fundamentally, the big question that we're coming back to, and this is very much linked to the way in which the project has been designed, is how can we use this kind of research, and research on environmental change, on the movements of beavers, to support resilience, support socio-ecological resilience among communities like these in the face of much wider changes. Again, the changes we're seeing here, possibly in some cases locally accelerated by beavers, they're part of wider patterns of change that are in themselves massively disruptive. And there are questions here about how you support resilience in the face of that. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there and pass over.
Thank you so much, both to you, Callum, and to Helen. Just now, I know we're going a little bit over, but I want to open it up between the panelists first, just to see if there are any questions. We're going to do a quick wrap up here in the next 5 minutes, but would any of you like to ask each other any questions before we close out?
Yeah, quickly. I had a question for Becky. I was wondering if you guys had tried using drones or, looking at stuff from Google Earth. Is that a way? Can you guys spot ponds? I saw some ponds in your pictures. Can you spot those from space?
Yeah, there's a local photographer that's come out and volunteered with the drone, and the drone is really useful even just on short surveys. Also for finding trucks for our shuttles. On the Mexico side, yeah, some of the partners use aerial photography to see which areas they want to survey for importance. And the US side is a little harder because the cottonwood covers the riparian area a little bit more. So we haven't used it specifically for surveys.
And one more question, thanks. So what's your sense? Are beavers gonna hang on in the San Pedro, if you had to guess?
I hope so. I think the activity or like the surveys are being done at an important time to bring more attention to them so that maybe they can expand. My hope is really yes.
But it sounded like the cattle issue was a big one too, just like preserving that riparian area.
Yeah, the cattle issue is a big one, especially for them being able to move beyond the public areas.
Okay, gotcha. So the public areas don't have cattle?
They do. They're not supposed to have cattle, but cattle are in there. Yeah.
Okay. I got you. Thanks. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, sure.
And I guess that provokes a bit, out of that question of what does the future of beavers look like in your study region? For you, Becky, and others, and what effects do you anticipate this will have on local ecosystems and human communities? Because that just kept coming up of the nuance, right? It's not always one way. It's not always good or bad. It's a very dynamic thing. And it's, I think, living in beaver world, doubling down on nuance is like the key message that I'm getting. So we'll start with you, Becky, and then we can go around really briefly, just talking about those effects.
Yeah, I think the beaver here in the Southwest, they are kind of holding on. And I think that to go forward, it will be more of a how they interact with humans and how humans want them to be in the ecosystem. There is a lot of cattle. The areas surrounding the public lands have a lot of cattle ranching. And so I think it'll be more working with those landowners more in the future. Yeah, and one of the dreams WMG is working for is to try to get beaver off the fur bearer list so it can no longer be trapped in Arizona, more as a way to bring attention to beavers.
Great, thank you, Becky. And anyone else who'd like to jump in on the thoughts of your particular region and areas of studies and work?
I'll jump in because I heard you use a word there, Adam, which I use a lot, but did not use in my presentation, which is dynamic. The Arctic is not that familiar with dynamic things. It's super stable. That's how it has characteristically been in the tundra. There's no fire, there's nothing to sort of reset the clock. And really with beavers moving into these streams, that is the principal change. It's not just like a wildfire, for example. Wildfire hits, that's time zero, and then everything sort of recovers or doesn't recover thereafter. But with beavers, it's this continual change. Ponds being built over here, ponds being drained over there, and that kind of continual change is what we're not so familiar with in the Arctic. And I don't necessarily think of it in terms of good and bad. And as you say, it's too complex to sort of categorize in that way. There are some negative aspects of this. There are some positive aspects of it. But the dynamic part of it is what's both exciting, maybe a little bit daunting, but very different. Helen, did you have any thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I really like the phrase doubling down on nuance. I think that perfectly reflects how I feel about the discussions around beavers. Because, for me, equally, yeah, neither good nor bad, but it's in the eye of the beholder as well, right? So, I mean, my priority working with the communities we work with is what is the perception of those communities. And, there's a lot of communities in the north are facing an awful lot of challenges with environmental change. And so, those are definitely considerations. But as a scientist, my role is very much to just go as far as the science. So they support and kind of direct our questions to a certain extent. And then what we're doing is saying, what are we seeing in terms of the changes? But there's no value judgment on that. It's just what's happening. And then it's not really for me as an outsider to even place a value judgment on that. It's the beavers are responding to change as wildlife do, So I think that's a really important distinction, actually, and that nuance in kind of understanding the context specificity of how beavers change. In one region that's super lake rich, we might see really high levels of change, and then we might see areas that are far less susceptible. So I think some of that context specificity of that we can get through ABON because we're working as this kind of networked group is a really important aspect of the research. And that also relates to how people feel about beavers, I think, as well.
Thank you, Helen. I love that question of going into communities, that question of what is your perception here, and not going in loaded with that answer for them before they've been able to express it. I think that's so valuable in all the work that we do. So we are going to start wrapping this up. I feel like we could talk for another hour, though, and I feel like that maybe there's a sequel to Beavers on the Edge at some point. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you all for being a part of this and offering up your research and your wisdom and experiences, and with much gratitude for being a part of our first webinar series. Be sure to sign up for July's edition of Beavers Uncovered, Beavers of the City, which is going to be in the link registration below. And also coming up on July 17th, the National Beaver Working Groups have an open house. There's also a link for that in the registrations below. And I also want to note that folks have been answering the Q&A, so be sure to look in there before we bop out, because there's been some really great responses to those questions that we weren't able to quite get to in our Q&A session. And finally, just want to put a shout out. June is Beaver Institute's 6th birthday. So this is our 6th birthday month. We've been on for 6 years. So a donation of any size, even $6, would be incredible and allow us to continue not only building this grassroots place-based response to climate change through beaver-related restoration and coexistence, but also provide tools, education, and resources like this to all of you. So again, thank you all very much, panelists. We will be in touch, and I hope that new thoughts and connections have been initiated here, and can't wait to see what comes from this. I'll definitely be in touch with all of you in the future. So happy solstice again, and we will be in touch. Goodbye. See you next month.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you all. Thanks, Ken. Bye.